Welcome to this explainer on constitutional architectures. Today, we are uncovering exactly how nations structure their ultimate authority. Because think about it, whether power is hoarded in one capital city or shared across regions, well, that dictates everything from how your local taxes are spent to how your most fundamental rights are protected. I'm your host, and today we're taking a patient, deep dive into the absolute foundations of public law. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today's lesson, just to help you structure your notes perfectly. We're going to cover power dynamics, unitary systems, federal systems, the global matrix, leading case law, and then wrap it all up with a complete lesson recap.
All right. Section 1, Power Dynamics, the core question of governance.
At the absolute heart of all constitutional law lies one surprisingly simple question. Where does sovereign power actually sit? Is it concentrated entirely in one central place, or is it permanently divided between two distinct levels of government? How a nation answers this one question essentially defines its entire legal existence.
In plain language, we basically have two primary models. First, a unitary system. This means the center holds all the cards, and it just lets regional or local governments exist at its own pleasure. Second, we have a federal system. This means the center and the regions constitutionally share the deck of cards, and neither side can unilaterally strip the other of its share.
Now let's look at the precise legal standard you'll need to know for this. In his 1946 work, scholar K.C. Weir established the classic test for federalism. He stated a true federal system requires that the general and regional governments are each within their own sphere, strictly coordinate and independent. They are not subordinate to one another. That word right there, coordinate, is essential. They operate side by side as legal equals in their designated domains.
Moving right along to Section 2, Unitary Systems, Centralized Authority.
So a unitary system features a single, supreme center. Literally, one national legislature can, in principle, legislate on absolutely everything. Because of this, policymaking is uniformly fast nationwide. Citizens typically just share a single, uniform citizenship, and crucially, there is no entrenched constitutional division of subjects between the national and local levels. To make this a bit more concrete, think of a unitary system like a massive corporate headquarters and its local branch offices. The headquarters can open a new branch, reorganize its management, or completely shut the office down at will. Those branches only have authority because the headquarters temporarily grants it to them.
But we need to remember the precise legal rule behind that analogy. Local units in the unitary system are mere creatures of statute. This means their existence is owed entirely to ordinary law enacted by the Supreme Center, not by any constitutional guarantee. The center creates them, and the center can erase them just as easily.
Now, looking at real-world examples, you might be thinking, wait a second, what about the UK? Since 1998, the UK has transferred massive amounts of power to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They even have their own parliaments and make their own laws. So is this devolution the same thing as federalism? Well, spoiler alert, it's a classic trap.
The critical distinction here is that devolution is not federalism. The UK remains strictly unitary in its constitutional theory. Why? Because devolved power is merely delegated. Westminster legally retains the power to revoke it at any given time. Federal power, on the other hand, is constitutionally entrenched. It's locked in.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, Federal Systems, Divided Sovereignty. A true federal system demands some very strict structural pillars. It requires a written, rigid constitution, so the rules of the game can't just be easily changed. Powers have to be formally divided by a list, like enumerated federal powers with residuary powers left to the states. You also need dual government machinery, meaning separate executives and legislatures at each level, and usually a bicameral legislature, where the upper house represents the regional units. But most importantly, it requires an independent judiciary with the power of judicial review to arbitrate center-state disputes, a power that actually originated in the U.S. with the famous 1803 case, Marbury v. Madison.
Consider federalism like a strict joint venture partnership between two massive companies. They sign a foundational contract detailing exactly who handles what. Neither partner can alter that foundational contract, take over the other's duties, or dissolve the partnership without the other's legally mandated consent.
Restating the precise legal rule here, the defining feature of federalism is constitutional supremacy. Not the center, not the units, but the Constitution itself is supreme. Both levels answer directly to it. Altering this division of powers requires complex supermajorities, making the Constitution rigid, exactly like we see in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, let's jump to Section 4, Global Matrix, Comparative Constitutional Law.
When we actually map these legal theories onto reality, some really distinct patterns emerge. Take a look. The USA exemplifies classical federalism, a written, rigid constitution, dual citizenship at the state and federal level, residuary powers left to the states, and entirely separate federal and state court systems. Then you have the UK, our classic unitary system with an unwritten constitution and devolved but definitely not entrenched powers. And then there's India, which possesses a highly unique, hybrid framework that we need to examine a bit closer.
The crucial thing to understand here is why K.C. Weir famously labeled India quasi-federal. See, India has the machinery of federalism, a written constitution and divided powers, but it has massive unitary overrides. We're talking a single citizenship, a single integrated judiciary, and residuary powers that vest in the union, not the states. Most profoundly, though, its emergency provisions, Articles 352, 356, and 360, actually allow the central government to effectively convert the entire nation into a unitary state during a crisis. Wild, right?
All right, let's move to Section 5, Leading Case Law, Applied Jurisprudence. We're going to apply all these concepts through two essential Supreme Court rulings that you absolutely must master.
Our first mandatory precedent is the 1963 case, State of West Bengal v. Union of India, which tackles the very nature of India's constitutional identity.
Here are the facts. The central government sought to acquire coal-bearing land owned by the state of West Bengal. So the legal issue was, did the center actually have the authority to acquire state property without consent, or did India's structure operate as a classical federation protecting state sovereignty? The holding? The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Union. They held that India is not a federation in the classical American or Swiss sense. States cannot secede, and sovereignty is not equally divided. The significance of this case is immense. It firmly established that legally, India is closer to an organic union than a true federation, which allows Parliament to acquire state property without state consent.
Our second critical case is S.R. Balmai v. Union of India from 1994.
The facts here involve the central government frequently, and frankly arbitrarily, dismissing state governments using Article 356, which is known as President's Rule. The issue before this massive 9-judge bench was, can the center dissolve state governments freely based on subjective judgments? The holding, the court strictly curbed the arbitrary use of Article 356. It mandated that a state government's majority must be tested objectively on the floor of the House, not just by the subjective opinion of a governor. And the significance? The court explicitly ruled that federalism is part of the basic structure of the Constitution. This is a massive legal doctrine, meaning that certain foundational principles are untouchable, and federalism cannot be casually dismantled by the center, even in a quasi-federal setup.
Let's quickly recap what we've mastered today. We started with the core distinction of power placement. We learned where standard that federal levels must be coordinate and independent. We contrasted unitary features, where local power is merely delegated as a creature of statute, against federal features, where power and constitutional supremacy are fully entrenched. We saw how the UK's devolution trap differs from actual federalism. We mapped all this on our comparative matrix, exploring India's fascinating quasi-federal overrides. And finally, we solidified it all with the West Bengal case, defining India as an organic union, and the Balmai case, which protected federalism as a basic structure against arbitrary emergency powers. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. If constitutional emergency powers can legally override federalism in times of crisis, is any system ever truly immune from centralization? Thank you so much for focusing in on this explainer today. Keep reviewing those notes, and I will see you in our next lesson.